The world had already been lost once. The dead walked, the living were scattered, and civilization as it once was had crumbled into dust. But for those who had survived, there was still something worse than the walkers. The rule of men who thrived in the ruins. And at the top of that food chain was Negan. Without Dwight's betrayal, the fragile alliance of Alexandria, Hilltop, and the kingdom never had a chance to rise. Every whisper of rebellion was silenced before it could take root. Every strategy was countered before it was ever deployed. Negan's spies, bolstered by Dwight's unwavering loyalty, infiltrated every opposing camp, ensuring that Rick and his people never gained the foothold they needed. The first major strike came against the kingdom. Ezekiel had barely begun rallying his people when the saviors descended upon them in the night, slaughtering indiscriminately. The gates were torn down, the royal court dismantled. Ezekiel himself was taken alive, paraded through the sanctuary, his once proud voice now reduced to broken pleas for mercy. His beloved Shiva, unable to fight against the overwhelming firepower, was gunned down as an example. The kingdom was no more. Hilltop was next. Maggie, still reeling from Glenn's murder, had tried to lead, tried to inspire hope. But without inside information, they were unprepared for the full force of Negan's wrath. The saviors cut through them like wildfire, their leaders executed on sight. Maggie, captured and dragged back to the sanctuary, was forced to kneel before Negan once more. He toyed with her, mocked her, before deciding that killing her outright would be too easy. Instead, she was thrown into a labor camp, forced to witness the destruction of everything Glenn had fought for. Alexandria, Rick's last stronghold, held out the longest. But with their allies gone and their supply lines cut, it was only a matter of time. The walls were breached, fires set, and the streets ran red with the blood of those who had dared to resist. Rick himself was captured, beaten within an inch of his life, and dragged before Negan. The man who had once stood defiant, the leader who had promised a better future, was now nothing more than a broken warrior at the mercy of a tyrant. Negan considered making an example of him, a public execution, a slow death. But then he had a better idea. "You're gonna watch," Negan told him, gripping Lucille with a casual ease. "You're gonna watch as I burn down everything you built. And then, when you've got nothing left, you're gonna beg me to put you out of your misery." Daryl wasn't spared either. Without Dwight's intervention, he was never given the chance to escape. The torture continued until there was nothing left of the man he once was. The stubborn fire in his eyes faded, replaced by something cold, something dead. When Negan finally deemed him broken, he was given a new role, enforcer. The man who had once been Rick's right hand now stood at Negan's side, a living testament to what happened to those who resisted. Carol disappeared. Some believed she had died in the chaos. Others whispered that she had fled into the wilderness, waiting for the right moment to strike. But there were no heroes left. Not anymore. But Negan's unchecked rule came at a cost. Fear could only keep people in line for so long. Eventually, desperation took hold. The scattered remnants of the fallen communities didn't band together in an organized rebellion. They became something far worse. Feral, reckless. They had nothing left to lose. It started with small attacks. Saviors found dead in the woods, their throats slit in the dark. Supply caches raided, food poisoned. Then it escalated. Entire outposts went up in flames, their occupants slaughtered in their sleep. Negan's own people began to turn on each other, paranoia setting in as trust eroded. No one knew who would betray them next. No one knew who might slit their throat when they weren't looking. And at the center of it all was Rick. He had once dreamed of rebuilding civilization, of creating something better. That dream was dead now. He didn't want to win. He didn't want to lead. He wanted to burn it all down. He became a ghost, striking from the shadows, leaving nothing but bodies in his wake. His new motto spread like wildfire. No kings, no leaders, no mercy. Negan, once untouchable, found himself backed into a corner. His sanctuary, once a beacon of control, was now a fortress under siege. His own lieutenants began questioning him. their loyalty shaken. Some tried to flee, only to be hunted down by rebels who cared more about revenge than survival. In the end, it wasn't Rick or Maggie who ended Negan. It wasn't a dramatic final battle or a heroic stand. It was abandonment. His empire crumbled, his people scattered, and when the dust settled, he was alone. No saviors, no Lucille, no kingdom to rule, just a man, wandering through the wasteland, broken and forgotten, and the world, already lost once, descended even further into chaos. The wasteland that Negan had once ruled with an iron grip had turned into something far worse than he had ever imagined. The saviors had always thrived on oppression, on knowing that their victims feared them more than the dead. But now, that fear had twisted into something else. It had become hatred, raw and unrelenting. And hatred didn't cower, didn't submit. It burned. The remnants of Alexandria, Hilltop, and the kingdom had disappeared into the shadows, but they hadn't died. They had become something new, something dangerous. They were no longer farmers or traders or hopeful survivors trying to rebuild the world. They were predators now. They struck without warning, without mercy. They left no one alive. Negan had built his empire on control, but control required structure. It required trust, and trust had become a relic of the past. His lieutenants whispered behind his back, their voices thick with suspicion. Every failure, every rebellion, every corpse left as a message in the night pushed them closer to the edge. Simon, once his most ruthless enforcer, had grown restless. He had always believed in strength, in power, but even he could see the cracks forming. He had pushed for more brutality, but Negan had hesitated. He had always known where to draw the line. But now the line was gone, washed away in blood and fire. The sanctuary was no longer the stronghold it had once been. The walls still stood, the soldiers still patrolled, but a sickness had taken root within. Desperation made men unpredictable. Some defected, vanishing into the night, hoping to escape the inevitable collapse. Others turned on each other, paranoia eating away at what little unity remained. And then there was Dwight, ever loyal, ever obedient. But even he had begun to question. He had done everything Negan asked, had helped crush their enemies before they could rise, had ensured that Rick, Ezekiel, and Maggie never had the chance to become threats. But for what? The world outside the sanctuary was burning, and inside it was rotting. He had watched as Daryl was broken piece by piece, had stood by as Negan paraded his victory. But victory had been fleeting. Daryl might have been a shell of the man he once was, but there was something in his eyes now that unsettled Dwight. He had been beaten, yes, but not erased, and that terrified Dwight more than he cared to admit. The attacks grew bolder. The rebels, if they could even be called that, had no interest in reclaiming what they had lost. They didn't want rule. They wanted ruin. They flooded outposts with the dead, turning Savior strongholds into slaughterhouses. They poisoned the sanctuary's water supply, forcing them to ration what little they had left. They didn't care if they died doing it. And Negan was starting to lose control. "We end this," Simon snarled one night, his patience frayed beyond repair. "We find their camp, we put them down like dogs, and we remind every last one of these bastards who we are." Negan had laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "You think they have a camp, Simon? You think they sleep? You think they eat around a fire and tell stories about how they're gonna take back the world? Wake the hell up. They don't want what we have. They don't want anything. They just want us dead." Simon had fallen silent, but the look in his eyes had been clear. He was beginning to wonder if Negan could still win this war. The final blow came when the sanctuary itself was breached. No one saw them coming. No warning shots. No demands. Just an explosion that ripped through the main gates, sending fire and smoke into the night sky. The dead poured in first, drawn by the chaos. And then came the others. Rick was among them. He wasn't the same man Negan had once faced down in the streets of Alexandria. That man had died when Negan had taken everything from him. What was left was something else entirely. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, like a man who had long since abandoned the idea of salvation. Negan saw him through the flames, standing amidst the wreckage, his revolver in one hand, a machete in the other. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Rick murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Negan gripped Lucille tighter, a slow grin tugging at his lips. "Maybe I just wanted to see what you'd turn into." Rick didn't answer. He didn't need to. The attack was merciless. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. The rebels tore through the sanctuary like a force of nature, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Simon was among the first to fall, his throat slit in the dark by a figure that vanished before anyone could see their face. Dwight turned on his own men, cutting through saviors who had once trusted him. Maybe he had been loyal once, but even loyalty had its limits. Daryl found his way to Negan's chambers, his crossbow in hand. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that spoke of old wounds, of vengeance long overdue. "Well, shit," Negan muttered, wiping blood from his forehead. "Guess you boys finally got your act together." Daryl didn't speak. He just raised the crossbow. Negan laughed, shaking his head. "Go ahead. Do it. Or don't. Hell, maybe you should let me live. See what happens when there's no one left to hate." The bolt fired, but it didn't hit Negan. It hit Lucille, splintering the bat into pieces. Negan stared at the shattered wood, at the remnants of the only thing he had ever truly loved. And then, for the first time in a long time, he felt fear. The world had already been lost once. Now it was happening again. But this time there would be no rebuilding. No leaders to step forward and claim power. Only the dead, and those too broken to care anymore. The sanctuary was burning. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and suffocating, turning the air into something unbreathable. The once imposing structure, the heart of Negan's empire, was crumbling under the weight of its own sins. Fire licked at the walls, casting flickering shadows of chaos as the dead clawed their way through the wreckage. But it wasn't the fire or the dead, or even the rebels that had truly destroyed it. It was Negan himself. He had built his kingdom on fear, on power, on the notion that the world needed a strong hand to guide it through the darkness. But fear was a fickle thing, could break just as easily as it could bind. And power? Power only lasted as long as there were people left to hold it up. Negan stood in the middle of it all, Lucille's shattered remains at his feet, his hands slick with blood. Some of it his, most of it not. The laughter had died in his throat, replaced by something hollow, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Loss, not just of his empire, not just of his men, but of the narrative he had told himself all these years, that he was the one in control, that he was the necessary evil. Now there was nothing left to control. Rick was still there, watching him through the haze, blood spattered across his face, his revolver hanging limp in his grip. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't anything. Negan let out a slow breath, glancing around at the bodies, at the echoes of screams still bouncing off the scorched walls. "You win," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Rick didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know what winning looked like anymore. A gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and sudden. Negan barely had time to move before the bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He hit the ground hard, pain spiderwebbing through his ribs. Simon's body lay a few feet away, his throat a ragged ruin, but someone else had taken the shot. Dwight stepped out of the shadows, his pistol raised, his face unreadable. Negan let out a low chuckle, clutching his shoulder. "Well, look at that. I was wondering when you were gonna grow a pair." Dwight didn't respond. His hands didn't shake. His aim didn't waver. He had betrayed before. He could do it again. "You should have let me die with the rest of them," Negan continued, pushing himself up onto one elbow. He gestured to the carnage around them. This ain't a victory. It's a goddamn funeral." Dwight's expression didn't change. His finger tightened on the trigger, but then Rick moved. "Don't," he murmured. Dwight hesitated. Negan let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head. "Still got a soft spot, huh? Thought you were past all that. Rick's gaze didn't waver. Killing you's too easy. Negan's jaw clenched. He could see the truth in Rick's eyes. The same truth that had been there the night he had taken a knee and watched Glenn's skull cave in. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about making sure there was nothing left of him. Leaving him alive, stripped of everything, was worse than any death they could give him. And Negan knew it. He pushed himself up, standing amidst the wreckage of what had once been his kingdom. "So what now?" he asked, voice rough. "You just let me walk?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Dwight, then at Daryl, then at the bodies scattered across the ground. "You'll wish we hadn't," he said finally. Negan exhaled, dragging his tongue over his bloodied lip. He looked down at the broken remains of Lucille, then back at the faces of the men who had once wanted nothing more than to see him dead. Now they didn't even care. That was the worst part. With slow, deliberate steps, he turned and walked. No one stopped him. The fires burned behind him, the screams fading into the distance, but he didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. Negan walked. The night swallowed him whole, the smoke and flames shrinking behind him with every step. His boots dragged through the dirt, through the blood and the ash, but he didn't stop. There was nowhere to stop. The world was empty now, stripped down to its bones, and he was just another ghost wandering through the wreckage. The silence was the worst part. For years, there had always been noise. Saviors laughing, the clang of metal gates, the murmur of voices plotting in the dark. Even the screams had been something. But now there was nothing. He clutched his wounded shoulder, fingers slick with blood, but the pain barely registered. It wasn't just his body that was broken. It was everything. Lucille was gone. His people were gone. The sanctuary was nothing but a smoldering ruin, and Rick Grimes had let him walk away like he was nothing. That was the real punishment. Death would have been easy. A bullet to the head, a knife in the gut, that he could have understood. Hell, he'd expected it. But this was worse, because now, for the first time since the world had ended, Negan was truly alone. He didn't know how long he walked. Hours? Days? It didn't matter. The road stretched endlessly before him, cracked and worn, littered with abandoned cars and the remains of those who hadn't been lucky enough to survive the first wave. The dead still shambled in the distance, their moans drifting through the night, but they weren't a threat. Not yet. The real danger was the living. He could feel them watching. Shadows moved between the trees, silent as the grave. He didn't see them, not clearly, but he knew they were there. The rebels. The ones who had burnt the sanctuary to the ground, who had torn through his people like wolves. They were hunting him. A part of him wanted to turn around, to face them, to go out swinging like the man he used to be. But that man was already dead. So Negan kept walking. The first attack came at dawn. A knife slashed through the air, catching him across the ribs before he even had time to react. He stumbled back, blood seeping through his shirt, but his attacker was already gone, vanishing into the trees like a ghost. A warning. The second came at dusk. A figure lunged from the shadows, a rusted machete swinging toward his head. He barely managed to duck, the blade missing by inches. He lashed out, catching his attacker across the jaw with his elbow, sending them sprawling into the dirt. A woman. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, but there was no mistaking the hatred burning in them. She knew who he was. Before he could react, she was gone, slipping back into the darkness. They were toying with him. A slow death. Negan gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to his ribs, feeling the warmth of his own blood beneath his fingers. "Shit," he muttered. He was gonna die out here. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a grand battle, but alone, hunted like an animal by the very people he had once ruled over. Fitting, he supposed. By the third night, he stopped trying to fight back. He had no weapons, no strength left to run. He just kept moving, waiting for the inevitable. Then, finally, it came. A figure stepped into his path, blocking the road ahead. Negan froze. Rick, or what was left of him. The man standing in front of him wasn't the Rick Grimes he had once mocked, once beaten into the dirt. That man had died along with everything else. This Rick was something else entirely. His face was hollow, his beard thick with grime, his eyes devoid of anything remotely human. Behind him, others emerged from the trees. The remnants. Maggie, Carol, Dwight. Daryl stood at Rick's side, his crossbow raised, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Negan let out a slow breath, his hands hanging limp at his sides. "So this is it, huh?" he rasped. "End of the road?" Rick didn't answer. Maggie stepped forward, her gaze burning into him. "You don't get a quick death," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Negan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah," he muttered. "Figured as much." Rick took a step closer. Negan didn't move. He was too tired, too broken to fight. Let them do whatever they wanted. He deserved it. But Rick didn't raise his gun. He didn't say anything at all. Instead, he just stared, like he was trying to figure out if Negan was even worth killing anymore. Negan met his gaze, and for the first time he saw it. It wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was emptiness. There was nothing left to fight for. Nothing left to win. Rick turned away first. "Let him go," he said. Maggie stiffened. "Rick, he's already dead." The others hesitated, but one by one, they stepped back, fading into the trees, leaving Negan standing alone in the middle of the road. Daryl was the last to leave. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at him. Then they were gone. Negan stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road ahead. A broken man in a broken world. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea where to go. No idea what came next. The world had already been lost once. Now it was just waiting to die.